Yeah, well, here with us today we have our senior football writer Ollie Kay and Chelsea writer and straight out of Cobham regular Liam Twomey as well. Liam, look, you were at Stamford Bridge over the weekend for the start of Enzo Maresca's era as Chelsea boss. 2-0 defeat, sadly, to Manchester City, but based on, I guess, coaching, squad cohesion, style of play, Manchester City are miles ahead of Chelsea. Was that result inevitable?
I don't know if it was inevitable, but it was certainly expected. And I think the reaction outside, the Chelsea dressing room in terms of supporters and people around the club was quite telling, because it's a mixture of, well, we expected that to happen. We expected that to happen, but also it could have been a lot worse. I think particularly given what happened in the pre-season meeting between these two teams, I think there were Chelsea fans that turned up at Stamford Bridge fearing that it could be a massacre. It could be really, really bad. It wasn't that. I think the reason why it wasn't that is just as much to do with City as it was with Chelsea. I think Chelsea were better. They looked more cohesive. They had more good moments with the ball and without the ball. You could see more of Maresca's work, I think. But at the same time, City, as is often the case at this stage of the season, were nowhere near their top level. They still did all the things you expect them to do in terms of being very, very joined up and very sure of themselves in terms of their pressing and their organisation. But they weren't at top speed. They always gave the impression that they had higher gears that they could click into if they needed to, and Chelsea never forced them to do that. On the whole, it was a pretty comfortable win for City, which stands in contrast to this fixture last year, which was a 4-4 draw, completely different type of game. City were worried that day. And I think the fact that it was pretty comfortable in the end says a lot about City and how much of a machine Pep Guardiola has built them into, whereby they can be missing so many recognisable names and still not really miss a beat on the pitch. But it also says a lot about where Chelsea are and the scale of the task that Enzo Maresca faces.
Yeah, that got me thinking, Ollie. The scale of the task. I think Liam put it quite nicely there. That Maresca faces, but not just Maresca for Chelsea, right? It wasn't too long ago that Chelsea beat, it wasn't too long ago that, Chelsea lifted the Champions League. But if you look at the style of play, you look at personnel, you look at how both teams are currently operating at this moment in time, huge chasms between both teams. How long do you think it will take for Chelsea to get to, I guess, when Manchester City are under this Bowley Clearlake era?
Well, at current rate of progress, you'd say they were going to get further and further away, because you look at where they were 2 years ago, and I think most people thought after that first summer they spent a lot of money. Most people felt they are not going to challenge. They're not going to win the league this season, but they might get close to Chelsea. That they weren't going to win the league, but they might get close to Manchester City because they'd invested a lot of money and. But you look back at that first transfer window now, and Raheem Sterling and Koulibaly and Aubameyang and so on, and it was pretty disastrous. And I would say they've had, this is their fourth transfer window since then. I don't think they've had a good one yet, really. They've added good players, that's for certain, but in terms of actually making the squad stronger and building something cohesive and impressive. They keep winning the transfer window in the eyes of people who want clicks and lots of eyeballs on the transfer window, but losing it in terms of improving the team. So I feel like this summer they have been a bit more focused, but only a bit. I still see them thrashing around a bit in terms of players they're thinking of bringing in and players they're thinking of moving out. The desperate need to move players out between now and the end of the transfer window. So I felt they were all right yesterday in terms of how they played against Manchester City. I thought it was a decent performance at times. I thought Lavia was a plus, Fofana was a plus most of the time. There were some positive aspects, but you would have said the same on the first day of last season against Liverpool. You'd said the same at various points. And I just feel that with Chelsea, it just seems to be, they seem to be sort of constantly wanting to change in a way that makes it hard to improve. I think they need to sort of give something a go and allow things to take shape more naturally. They were improving in the second half of, or certainly the final quarter of last season under Pochettino. I'm still quite amazed that they thought it was the right thing to move him on, but that's done now, and it's on to Maresca, and it wasn't a bad start yesterday by any means, but it was yeah, I think there's an enormous gulf to bridge in terms of Chelsea, Manchester City, but also Chelsea and Arsenal. And as for what, we're looking at a Premier League that's probably a bit more unpredictable this season, but I think Chelsea are a team who could be wildly unpredictable. They could really kick on, but they could also unravel further. It just depends how Maresca can get hold of it and shape it.
Let's just put it in perspective. It is still Maresca's first match. It's very hard to gauge where this is all going to end up. But we spoke about it in pre-season. The possibility that fans could turn early, and considering what's going on off the field, on the field, where do you think it sort of lies with the fans at this moment in time going into this season? Is it a sense of optimism? Let's just see where we are, because let's face it, it could also turn quite quickly in the next week, 2-3 weeks.
Well, I think you might have seen that last week Chelsea were bottom of the Athletics Hopeometer survey among all Premier League fan bases whose readers responded to us. And that's pretty remarkable, when you consider that level of gloominess, along with just the sheer number of players that Chelsea are signing, the investment they continue to make in the transfer market, and the sense of optimism within the club that they now have what they feel is a top 4 level of squad largely in place, albeit there are some players to sell, quite a few of them, and the right coach in their eyes to build around longer term in Enzo Maresca in this possession-focused positional style of play. As far as the fans go, there were already signs of some tension with that on the opening day against City. There were numerous sequences. I don't know how well this came over on TV, but in the stadium it was very, very evident, of Robert Sanchez walking the ball up out of his penalty area, rolling it under his foot, Chelsea trying to bait the Manchester City press, and Manchester City refusing to take that bait and waiting for them to play a pass before they made a move. So it was a big staring contest. And this was all happening in front of the Matthew Harding stand, where a lot of the really hardcore Chelsea season ticket holders sit. And you could hear the groans, you could hear the rising frustration that Chelsea were not showing more urgency. To bear in mind they were 1-0 down at this point, to get back into the game, to make Manchester City uncomfortable. And I think the way Chelsea approached the game against City last year, where they really went for the jugular, and it was a wide open game. It was 4-4. It could have been any score, really. I think that was much more the style that would get Stamford Bridge engaged than what they saw from Maresca, the early returns of Maresca ball against Manchester City. But as I was sitting there watching that, I was thinking, if you guys are frustrated now, it's going to be a long season for you, because this is the way Chelsea want to play. This is the way they're committed to playing. This is the way Maresca wants to build up possession. It's not going to change, and the fans actually will have an influence on whether it works or not, because if they get on players' backs, if Robert Sanchez feels the anxiety from the stands behind him as he's trying to make decisions under pressure, there will be more mistakes, and it will become a really bad cycle of errors and and things that will undermine what Maresca's trying to do. So it's not up to the fans whether this works or not, but they do have an input into how well Chelsea actually adapt to Maresca's style.
Yeah, Ollie, I was just thinking about Maresca himself, and as Liam just pointed out, Maresca ball, whatever that might look like in its evolution, will take time to embed itself. But he signed on for a 5-year deal. I can't remember the last Chelsea manager that lasted 5 years. Does he have the time to embed Maresca ball under this regime?
Well, isn't the longest serving isn't the longest serving manager of the Premier League era Mourinho, with his 3 years in his first spell? A lot of managers who, Graham Potter signed a 5-year contract, didn't he? And lasted, 7 months, something like that. It's a club which is probably the club in some ways that is least suited to this kind of long-term rebuild and regeneration, but also a club that is in need of a long-term vision. I would say that even in the Abramovich era, you would praise Chelsea for what they were on the pitch. You would praise them for managing to sign big players and spending Abramovich's money well and having a team full of winners and so on. But they were never a team that you'd think, their long-term vision, their long-term strategy, look how it's bearing out brilliantly. It was always a sort of, it was never that kind of, let's buy into a 5-year project, let's even buy into a 2-year project. Whenever that was mooted under Villas-Boas or Sarri or Lampard, it was quickly it was sort of abandoned really at the first sign of trouble and that's by the ownership, not necessarily by the fans. And that's happened with Potter, and so I think there is a restlessness around Chelsea's fans. I mean, they've been, that Champions League run and the Champions League win was behind closed doors, really, wasn't it? I know there were a few people at the final in Porto, but it was that season. Chelsea's fans, since crowds were let back in 3 years ago now, they've really not had a lot to enjoy or a lot to really sort of rally behind. They've seen an awful lot of money spent and an awful lot of huge, ridiculous amount of players come and go, and more come than gone so far. But it's the sort of identity of the team and just seems to be, or the identity of the club seems to be in question at the moment. Nobody seems quite sure what Chelsea are meant to be. There's not that sort of John Terry figure, Frank Lampard figure, or even a Didier Drogba type figure that fans could really think, he's our man. They thought it was Conor Gallagher, some of them last season, and he's now seemingly on the way out and not welcome to train with the team and not having his name on the back of the programme. It's a strange situation. It's a sort of culturally fascinating situation, and it has to work, because the club have bought into it to such an extent, not just with Maresca and a 5-year contract, but with all these huge long contracts with all these young players, that if it doesn't work with these players, what do you do with them? What do you do with them when they're on 7-8 year contracts? I could see Chelsea having a real struggle selling some of the players they already don't want. So it has to work. It needs patience, but whether it deserves patience is, that remains to be seen.
Anyway, you are listening to the Athletic FC podcast. Drop us an email if there's something you want to know more about or think we should be discussing. It's tafcpod@theathletic.com. Get in touch on tafcpod@theathletic.com.
Just to say, I've refused to dye my hair over the last 2 years. Part of that is to track the stress of parenthood, but also to as a kind of live marker for what covering Chelsea can do to someone.
Ollie, that was a big pause for Maresca there. He made a big call on day one of the Premier League season, dropping Raheem Sterling, the most experienced player at that club right now. Sterling's team actually responded before the game with a statement saying he'd seek clarity over his future. Look, choosing not to select a player like that who has actually played very well against Manchester City when Chelsea have played them. That is a massive call, isn't it?
It's a massive call in one respect, yeah, because of the profile of the player. I don't think it would have been that surprising if, let's move him on, let's try to move him on, because it hasn't really worked. He's not. I mean, his form had gone downhill in his final 2 years at Manchester City, and it's continued to go downhill. And there are mitigating circumstances from Sterling's point of view, in that he's had this huge turnover of managers at Chelsea. There's been no consistency in terms of selection, and no consistency in terms of the names on the team sheet around him. Different systems, different coaches, different players, but it hasn't worked. It's let me look. It's 14 goals and 7 assists in 59 Premier League appearances. Now that's way down on what everybody felt Sterling was capable of when Chelsea paid £47.5 million for him 2 years ago. I think everybody would have thought that was a sort of slightly disappointing return for one season, never mind 2 seasons. So yeah, I can understand the club thinking, well, we've got Mudryk that we believe in, rightly or wrongly, long term. We've just signed Pedro Neto. They're looking at João Felix. They've got Nodi Madueke and Cole Palmer, and they've got Nicholas Jackson, who can play through the middle, and other players, Nkuku and other players who might yet come and join before the end of the transfer window. So there's this huge surplus of players. He's 29, nearly 30. He looks like he's a player who's in decline, unless that's unfair to say so. On big money, dwindling resale value, it would probably make sense to sort of cut the losses. But whether making that call in mid-August is the right thing to do, I don't know. I just don't see. I don't see how. Well, I don't see an obvious way out for him, and for him or for the club if they decide he's got to move on.
Liam, is it fair to say just that Raheem Sterling isn't firing on all cylinders? I look at what he's been asked to do since he's been at Chelsea, and the organisation around who's been in charge at Chelsea, at Manchester City under Pep Guardiola. Very different vision, very different style, very different cohesion on what Pep expects from his team. You look at his Liverpool time as well. I mean, there was a very clear plan of how you want to utilise this player. If you've had how many managers in the last 2 years or so, I mean, how does a player find his feet, excuse the pun, in a team like that?
Yeah, I think it's a very credible argument. Look, Manchester City, and they showed this again at Stamford Bridge, they're a Swiss watch. Everything works. Every little piece does its job perfectly. Everything is incredibly well organised. Other watches are available, of course. Don't just buy a Swiss watch. But the point is that everything is so well established that a player like Savinho can come in for his Premier League debut and look like he's been playing for Manchester City for years and just seamlessly slot in. And Raheem Sterling had the benefit of that, all of that, when he was at City working with Guardiola. He's a system star, and I say that not to denigrate him, because I think he was absolutely maximised at City in the role that Guardiola gave him, where he knew when the ball's in this area, you crash the back post, you're going to get a certain number of tap-in chances a season. Your job is to always put yourself in those positions and then finish at, kind of normal efficiency for a forward. And he did that brilliantly. And his production was superb as a result, year on year. So when the system works, Raheem Sterling's a very productive player, but he's not he's not a superstar. He's not a rising tide that will lift all the boats. And there are a lot of boats at Chelsea. He can't lift everything when it's not working. And not only have Chelsea not always had a functioning system when he's in his time at the club, the system's been changing all the time as well. And his role along with that, he was used on the right a lot by Tuchel, then on the left more by Pochettino, and now he's not being used at all. But his production's still been okay at Chelsea. The overall stats: 19 goals, 12 assists. in 81 appearances across all competitions. It's better than Mudryk. It's roughly equivalent to Noni Madueke, I think, if you go sort of per minute. But it's not superstar production. And this is the problem with Sterling's Chelsea chapter, is that it was doomed from its conception when they unveiled him with a glitzy photo shoot in Beverly Hills in the first summer of the new ownership and gave him this massive 5-year contract to make him the club's top earner. And then he was coming in talking about contending for the Ballon d'Or. Seriously. You know, he seriously believed he could do that. The expectations were always out of whack with what Sterling actually is as a player, which is a very good one, being paid like a great one. And this is the problem Chelsea have now, is that he is probably the highest profile reminder. I mean, you could make the argument for Wesley Fofana as well, but he's still got plenty of time to change the narrative of his Chelsea career. He's the highest profile reminder of the summer of 2022, which is now a transfer window that the ownership would much rather forget, because they didn't have this sporting structure in place. They didn't have all the things that they're doing now in place, and they made a lot of what they would consider mistakes as a result, some of which are players who've left the club, like Koulibaly, Aubameyang. Sterling is not a mistake necessarily as a player, but his contract is completely out of line with the contracts that they've handed out over the last 18 months to all these other players that they've signed. And so my feeling on it now, you know, that everything we're hearing from Chelsea is that technical decision by Maresca, the club is fully behind him, but it's led by Maresca. My feeling now is what my feeling has been for much of the last 18 months, which is Chelsea would much rather have that Raheem Sterling contract off their books. It limits them, and he's not producing in line with what he's being paid. And that was a key factor, incidentally, in why Chelsea moved for Pedro Neto, because they, in Maresca's system, where fullbacks either invert or stay back for the most part, there's a lot on the wingers to produce 1v1, to create advantages for the attack to flourish. And if you don't have that production coming from the wings, you have problems. And Chelsea are very confident on the right that they have that production with Cole Palmer, and Madueke has had good moments as well. But they felt it was a matter of urgency that they acquired a more productive winger on the left. And that's a big part of the reason they moved for Pedro Neto. And that is a reflection of how they feel about Sterling, how they feel about Mudryk so far. And that's where things are. I think it's an issue for Sterling in terms of the expectations and the prism he is being viewed through at Chelsea because of his contract, not necessarily who he is as a player, which I don't think has fundamentally changed.
Ollie, do you think, back to Sterling in that respect, you know, do you think it was a right move for him and his team to release a statement then asking for quote unquote clarity of his future on the day of the first game of the season? You know, I thought it was quite interesting when that came out, but also the wording of it I found fascinating too.
Yeah, I didn't think it was an inflammatory statement or anything like that, and it wasn't one that was released proactively and as an attempt to undermine or anything like that. What happened was I think the Daily Mail had caught a sniff of or more than a sniff of the team news and the fact that Sterling was going to be left out of the squad and had gone to his camp for right of reply to this, and sometimes a player's camp or a player their agent will say no comment, or sometimes they'll sort of give a silent nod and a wink, or sometimes they'll completely ignore you, or sometimes they'll brief with more counter information than you expect. In this instance, what they did was release, this is Sterling's PR team, or a PR consultant that Sterling hires and employs. They released a statement basically kind of watering down the story, really, but confirming it, that he was out of the team, and just saying that, you know, he was committed. And then this line about he'll continue to be committed, but we'll be looking forward to gaining clarity, or whatever it was. I don't think there was anything in the statement that would make you think, wow, I'm surprised the statement itself has had has caused as much of a stir as it has. And probably that just tells you that, you know, we're not used to hearing from unhappy players directly or indirectly. But it's not Raheem Sterling sort of going to war with Liverpool over his contract back in 2015, when he was, you know, when they very proactively, his camp at the time very proactively went out and did media interviews accusing Liverpool of, you know, undervaluing him and so on. It's not Jadon Sancho accusing Eric Ten Hag of whatever he accused him of, and sort of claiming he was being scapegoated. It's nothing like as inflammatory as any of that. It was slightly unusual for a player's camp to give an on the record statement in that situation. But I don't think that's. I think the bigger issue is that he had already been made surplus to requirements for the opening game, and appears to be surplus to requirements for the season. I don't think the statement itself can be said to have changed anything. If anybody at Chelsea is saying, well, that's made it impossible, I think they're being a little bit opportunistic. I think it was a normal statement expressing normal emotions that probably aren't normally expressed in public. But if Sterling himself had been grabbed by journalists after the game and said, you know, I need to find out what's happening. You know, I'm committed to the club, but I need to get some clarity. I don't think anybody would argue with that, would they? And that would also be releasing a statement. So yeah, I think the big issue is slightly obscured by the statement story.
I think the problem is that the timing of that on record comment, which, as you say, Ollie, was unusual. Usually, I think you'd go to a player's camp and you'd get an off record steer or some sort of background that this is, you've come to us with a story. This is the story from our perspective, and you go from there as a journalist. Whereas you're not necessarily expecting an on record statement. Certainly not so close to a match like that, and the timing of it meant that Maresca was asked before the game as well as after the game, and I think the problem Sterling has with Chelsea fans, I think, is that it leans into a specific criticism that some fans have levelled at him, which is a perception that he's a selfish player who puts himself above the team. Now, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's actually the way Sterling has been in his career or at Chelsea. But by having that statement out there and making your own situation a huge talking point ahead of Maresca's first game, a game that, you know, they were already expected to have a very difficult time against Manchester City, it leans into that perception. It reinforces it among the people that are minded to view you in an unfavourable light anyway. Especially when you contrast with some of the other situations at Chelsea right now, where we're not getting statements from Conor Gallagher's people or Trevor Chalobah's people, players who have a lot more sympathy from the Chelsea fan base, and in Gallagher's case, you know, spent 3 or 4 days in Madrid quite recently thinking that they were going to be completing a transfer that was then pulled away. We'll see if it gets revived. But so I think that's the issue that Sterling has in terms of the PR side of things. But in terms of the actual substance of this, I also think the fact that this played out publicly before the game is a really telling signal that there is no trust between the player and the club right now. I think that there's considerable scepticism, it's fair to say, I think, from Sterling's camp that this truly is, as Maresca says, a technical decision led by him, because earlier in pre-season, Maresca was quoted saying Sterling's one of our most important players. So this is a real about turn 2 weeks before the end of the transfer window. And it sets up an uncertain situation for everyone, because as Ollie has detailed, unlike the Gallagher and Chalobah situations, there isn't an obvious landing spot for Sterling. Like there isn't an obvious off-ramp here that will satisfy everyone and tie this story up in a neat little bow. It feels like it's going to stay quite messy for a while.
Yeah, that got me thinking. What are his options? Because we've pointed out, you've got a player that's a system player, and you've also got a player that's got 3 years left on his contract, but also a player that's on about just over £300,000 a week. It's not many clubs that can afford that, Ollie. What options does Raheem Sterling have right now?
Well, Juventus have been linked over the past 10 days or so, and from what we've been told fairly tenuously at this point, there might be interest, but it's not firmed up into anything that's got serious. The difficulty is that when a player is out of favour at one of the big clubs, well, when he's been unwanted and sold by probably the best team in Europe in recent years, Manchester City, brackets possibly Real Madrid, but then he's moved to another club, another big club, big spending club, and it's not worked out. It's where do you go? Where do you go? There's this huge financial divide in football where only sort of maybe 6, 7, 8 clubs in world football can afford that level of wage. And if one of those clubs, and probably the worst of those teams that can afford that, can in Europe at least, has found that he hasn't cut the mustard there, where does he go? There is not the kind of, back in the 90s, 2000s, you would have had a sort of second tier of clubs who would be willing to spend, would be willing to take big clubs' cast-offs and pay them big money, make them the star. And you just don't really have that now. The closest equivalent is of course, Saudi Arabia, but whether Sterling with sort of 11 days left in the transfer window wants to suddenly think, oh yeah, do you know what? I'll go to Saudi Arabia. I think it's quite unlikely. I could see that when you consider how limited the options might be for Sterling. I'm almost tempted to think what he should do is dig his heels in and say, not do a Winston Bogart and stay there for the next 3 years, getting paid a fortune and never playing, but thinking to himself, do you know what? I'm good enough to get back into this team. They need homegrown players, by which I mean English players, to fill the quota in the squad. They're hoping to sell Gallagher, Chalobah, etc. They're going to need guys like me around, and also to look at people like Mudryk and Madueke and think, why should I be behind these guys in the pecking order? If he reaches, if he performs as he can have a value to Chelsea, whether they recognise that currently or not. And if he digs his heels in and says, I don't want to go, I want to fight for my place, I don't really see how Chelsea can object to that, and it might be his best option.
Okay, well, Liam, Chelsea looks set to be amongst the biggest spenders yet again in this window, and dare I say, can we expect any more action over this summer transfer window? You talked about Conor Gallagher, but also, I guess, underlining that is what might happen with Joao Felix, for instance, from Atletico Madrid, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't be shocked if something happens there, because it's clear that Atletico, well, certainly Diego Simeone, still wants Conor Gallagher, and that they haven't signed another midfielder. So I still think he is certainly top of Simeone's wish list at the very least for that position. And Chelsea do like Joao Felix. I don't think they liked him on the terms that they would have had to sign him after his 6-month loan in the summer of 2023. But those aren't the terms at which the deal would or might get done now. I think it would be on significantly lower wages that would be an easier fit with Chelsea's current salary structure and a significantly lower transfer fee. So I'm not saying that will happen, but it's very possible that it could, because there's still a sense, I think, that Chelsea and Atletico kind of need each other, and so we'll see what happens there. Chelsea are still looking to reinforce in attack. I mean, they've not closed the door on Victor Osimhen. I think I don't expect to see them going out and spending a 9-figure transfer fee on him, but if there's a deal to be done there on terms that Chelsea are comfortable with, we already know that they and Napoli are talking about Romelu Lukaku, and Chelsea are very motivated to send him there. So there could be a few trade-like negotiations going on in the last couple of weeks, but the bulk of Chelsea's business, the overwhelming demands, I think, on Lawrence Stewart and Paul Winstanley's time in the remainder of the window will be on ensuring that Chelsea get as many of the players out who need to get out, because the squad, the portfolio, whatever you want to call it, is way too big with players at Cobham. You cannot have a sizable group training away from the first team and the development squad all season. It makes no sense. It makes no sense for their value. It makes no sense for Chelsea. We've already seen some outgoings since I published our big piece on the 53 players. That number is already smaller. I expect it to get a lot smaller before the end of the transfer window.
Wow. That's what that was my question. How small can you go? And it's not that long.
They'll end up with a 5-a-side team. Yeah, they want to narrow it right down. They're going the opposite approach now: quality over quantity. I think they want to give Maresca, a fairly cohesive 24, 25-man squad. Not including a couple of youngsters that they really like. Tyreek George, Josh Achiampong went on the pre-season tour of the US, so it wouldn't surprise me if they're kept around the first team. Not guaranteed, but I think they could be kept around the first team to train and get minutes here and there. But what they don't want is, a Graham Potter Mark II situation where you have 35, 40 players and games going on adjacent pitches, players getting changed in the corridor at Cobham. That there's no desire to return to that. There's a recognition that was a farce and not conducive to being a sensible competitive team on the pitch. So they that's the reason why they've already put a lot of these guys in a separate group, because they're trying to protect the integrity of Maresca's training sessions and the work that he's doing. But that state of affairs will not hold beyond the end of the window, because you can't just keep those guys on their own indefinitely.
Yeah, super quickly, Liam. I've just realised I watched Chelsea yesterday. Still no shirt sponsor. Second time, no shirt sponsor. I mean, this is a Premier League team, right? Why are they struggling to get a shirt sponsor for people that aren't Chelsea fans? That must be quite strange for a team who are trying to be of a particular calibre and of a particular ilk.
Yeah, I mean, I think they could get a primary shirt sponsor tomorrow if they wanted to, but it's about price. They don't want to lock themselves into a multi-year commitment with a sponsor while they're not a Champions League team. So this feeds into the broader picture, I think, where Chelsea's commercial growth under Clearlake and Bowley, there has been growth, but it's not been the kind of magic bullet for the revenues of the club that were maybe some people were maybe hoping for when you'd have these American capitalists coming in with their marketing commercial know-how. And I think a big part of that is that there's a recognition at Stamford Bridge that the commercial side has a ceiling as long as the football isn't working, and the football team has to be winning at a level that is conducive with Chelsea's modern standards. They need to be back in the Champions League. They need to be competing for trophies every season. And then you will start to see deals of the kind of value that they're looking for to really take the club on. So I think they've made a conscious business decision. They did it last year before they reached the arrangement with Infinite Athlete. And they've made a conscious business decision again, not to just take whatever was on the table just to get a front shirt sponsor for this season. They'd rather go into the year and maybe sell a few shirts without a sponsor. They're quite popular that way, I hear, among fans. And sign a deal, maybe another ad hoc 1-year deal, and just see where they are again next summer.
Okay, Ollie, let's leave this with you in terms of what we're seeing at Chelsea. This is a team that's seriously hemorrhaged a lot of experience, also seriously hemorrhaged a lot of a winning DNA. I mean, we just spoke about Raheem Sterling. Think about the amount of trophies he's won, and I'm trying to think about what they're trying to do moving forward. Can we see any sort of plan here? Because you said it has to work earlier, but this is based on I guess the DNA of a baseball team, long-term contracts, all that kind of stuff, right? Like, it's very much a baseball ideology. Is there something here that we're missing? Is this just the most outlandish idea that could actually land?
If you're saying, is there a strategy? There's clearly a recruitment strategy. There's a very, very clear recruitment strategy, which is about signing young players and in the expectation that they develop, and those who work will thrive in a team for the next decade. Those who don't quite work might be sold on at profit, and I think there's nothing new in thinking that's a reasonable approach. But what's fairly extreme in Chelsea's case is the numbers of players they've signed. Well, it is extreme, no doubt about that, and so far it hasn't worked at all in terms of results on the pitch, which, bar the final sort of 8 weeks of last season, have been consistently mid-table form for 2 seasons. In terms of players really soaring in value and improving, developing, because I think with the exception of Cole Palmer and maybe one or two others like Malo Gusto, we've not really seen young players improving enormously because of the dysfunctional environment that we've talked about. I'd look at Chelsea and think, yes, it could definitely improve this season, because I think, other than that late season spell and under Pochettino, I think they've underperformed terribly for 2 seasons. I think they have to get better. It's I would expect them to get better, but whether. Yeah, as I said at the start, there's got to be this concern that rather than get better, they get worse. And it's probably only a small risk, but it is a risk when everything just seems quite haphazard in terms of the number of players they're signing, whether there's much sort of reliable quality. By reliable, I mean consistent week after week, like Cole Palmer was last season, like almost nobody else was last season. Sterling wasn't reliable. Jackson shows quality but hasn't been sort of consistently reliable. This ever-changing number of central defenders, all of whom have shown quality in at times, but there's never really been that sort of continuity and consistency. Obviously, Caicedo and Fernandes and Lavia, who we've only finally begun to see. There's been very little in terms of consistent performance from those three. Obviously, I excuse Lavia because he was injured for majority of last season. But you expect them to improve, and I did see certain encouraging signs yesterday. I did. I thought the performance in some respects was decent, and there were some decent signs last season, but it really needs somebody to grab hold of it and drag it forward, and Maresca has to show that he's the one to do that, because I think after what is it, is he the 5th manager in 2 years? You need something that you can actually sort of pin your hopes on and invest hope and invest belief in. And at some point, they're going to have to give something a go and give something patience. But as I said earlier, that there's the possibility that they won't merit the patience that's shown. I don't think all the young players that they've signed have shown that they are worth the patience either. So it's a really difficult one. I expect them to improve, but I really think things could go either way with Chelsea this season.
Right, let's leave it there. Liam, Ollie, thank you so much for your time, and also you do not forget you can catch more from Liam over on Straight Out of Cobham as well. We'll be back tomorrow for another deep dive into the biggest story from the world of football. Thanks for listening.
If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.